T.B.Photo X1.5 TFX, and welcome back to another video. This video is going to be titled Not My Cup of Tea, or Is It? The reason for this is that this is not going to be a video about photography gear per se, so yeah, it's going to be basically a little bit more about me rambling about some things that I started to notice when you post pictures on different types of forums, and the kind of feedback that you can get and what other people get in the way of feedback. And I started to pondering this, that this is one of those hard-boiled questions that a lot of people have tried to define. And what happens when someone breaks the norm of photos, and what makes photos art anyway, and what qualifies something as art? So I would like to start this with a quote from Gandhi. That might sound a little bit strange to start with, but first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. Well, have that a little bit in the back subconsciously, but the thing I want to emphasize with this is that graphics imaging technology has really skyrocketed since the mid-1980s. You know, both 2D and 3D. One of the artists that I think have been a little bit in the forefront of this has been David Hockney, a British contemporary artist, still active and so on. But when he started in the 1960s and so on with his paintings, Splash and later A Bigger Splash, it was a little bit of a controversial, because it was coined as lazy art, because it was basically the same picture from a little bit of different perspectives, but basically the same type of picture with very, you know, pastel type colors and so on. And a lot of people it was a little bit criticized, but today it's a very valuable piece of art. But anyway, I'm gonna put the link in the description from an interview with Hockney when he talked about the perception of things, and that he's always looking, and that can have something to do with his choosing of colors and saturation, and you know. But what he talked about was that if you take a taxidermist who stuffs an owl and you put that real stuffed owl up next to a Picasso painting of an owl, either one of Picasso's drawing or the death owl from the 1950s, the Cubist version. I mean, what he said in the interview was that if you put them next to each other, the marvelous thing when a person views the Picasso, he isn't really seeing an owl. The marvelous thing is because it's not an owl, it's a human looking at an owl that is depicted with that Picasso in Hockney's insight. So the aspect there is more owlness in the Picasso than the actual stuffed owl. And I'll come back to that a little bit later, why that is. Or rather, I can take it now, because there is a brilliant book by Scott McCloud. Let me see, it was supposed to come later in my Understanding Comics. And what does comic books have to do with some of the most brilliant minds in art from the 19th century, 20th century? Well, what McCloud talks about, and I'll put a picture of it here, is that when you simplify an image, we as the readers usually subconsciously add a lot of our own ideas and personality traits to that image. So if you look at Picasso's simplified drawing of an owl, we will actually subconsciously fill in all the parts that are missing. But anyway, continuing then, in 1986, Hockney was asked by BBC 2, British Broadcasting Station 2, to just try out and I'm gonna read this from the paper because this is a tongue twister, Quantel a Paintbox graphics system, and I'm gonna put a picture of how that machine looked up here on the side, because this was a huge machine and quite expensive, over $100,000 apparently, in the mid-1980s. But the thing was that this machine was used to make meteorology maps and so on for news broadcasts, and do overlays for news and so on. But Hockney coined the term that this system was painting with lights, and I'm going to put the link to that interview in the description below. And this system, Hockney thought about it that it was when he painted with a stylus on a surface pad, it was transcribed onto a television screen. And what he meant was that this was like drawing with stained glass, because what he drew on the sketch pad only existed in that televised medium. It didn't exist in any physical form. But it's interesting because that was, you can see, a precursor to what later became Photoshop. And interestingly enough, in 1989, Hockney was asked by Adobe to attend the launch of the first iteration of Photoshop. And after that presentation, Hockney was quoted saying, "That's the end of chemical photography." And I don't think anybody could really fathom how right he was. But then when we came to the end of chemical photography and we really went over to the digital era of photography, which we did now in the early 2000s, you have one photographer that really took this digital medium and ran with it. And that's also one of those photographers that was ridiculed in the beginning, that all of this was just it was just gimmick photography. But well, Mr. Trey Ratcliffe, the guy who owns the site Stuck in Customs, and he's basically known today as Mr. HDR. I mean, this guy, I mean, this is a great proponent of drone photography, you know, mirrorless camera technology, the Aurora HDR software for image editing, and a lifelong Star Trek The Next Generation fan. So yeah, that's Mr. Trey Ratcliffe. And also him ridiculed for his HDR, that it was, I think it was some kind of MIT computer software that he was playing around with his photographies to make this HDR stuff. And basically his biggest fan for his website in the beginning, his blog, was his mother. And people ridiculed his HDR pictures. But today, he is actually one of the first HDR photographers that has a exhibition at the Smithsonian Institute. So there you go. Then we also have another great photographer, David LaChapelle. LaChapelle is one of those outrageous photographers without shame, but a brilliant person to picture societal satire, to satirize society in very suggestive pictures. Because when you look at them the first time, they look very suggestive, almost borderline pornographic. But when you have looked it over a couple of times, you start to see that, wait a minute, this is social satire. And ridiculed in the beginning by a number of groups, but today he is a really highly regarded, both fashion, model, celebrity and product photographer. And another one who was a little bit ridiculed also, Mario Testino. Testino is one of those photographers. He comes from Latin America, and his stick was that he is basically the guy that takes the picture when the party is at its peak. So all of his pictures were kind of party pictures, and a lot of, extremely celebrity pictures. Yeah, but the thing is that then suddenly he takes the, you know, the, what should we call, headshots of Princess Diana. And there he portraits her without the jewelry, without the fancy clothing, just her as a person. And it becomes a complete 180 to what he was used to do. And that was also something that took the photography world by storm when he did it. And speaking about photographers that did outrageous things, but and ridiculed in the beginning and then, you know, celebrated, Swedish photographer Lennart Nilsson. What Lennart did was that he actually photographed aborted fetuses, sperms, eggs, and microscope pictures of bugs. Let that sink in. And you know what that landed him? The cover of Life magazine. How a child grows. He turned that aborted fetus into something beautiful. And he did this at a time when abortions, at least here in Sweden, was a very, very hot topic. So if you want to check him out, he is well renowned for doing these anatomical pictures of the human body and humans, how we develop in a womb and so on. So he has taken a lot of very, very internationally famous and acclaimed medical photographs. So that's Lennart Nilsson. And that landed him on the front page, the cover of Life magazine. So yeah, imagine going from that type of ridicule to be on the cover of Life magazine for something positive. Excuse me. And then we have another person who was both an artist, a painter and so on, but also a photographer, Andy Warhol. Basically, he was contemporary with both David LaChapelle, who got famous through Andy Warhol, and David Hockney, who was basically, while Andy Warhol was in New York, the west coast of, or rather the east coast of the US, David Hockney had his studio in California. So it was west, you know, East Coast Andy Warhol and West Coast David Hockney. So you have a little bit of that thing going on. But basically, when Andy did an exhibition in the 60s, people started to say, why buy a print of a soup can when you can buy the actual can for 50 cents and get a meal out of it? Well, today 32 cans of soup is a priceless modern art treasure. And if we're gonna quote Andy Warhol, well, in the future everybody will be famous for 15 minutes, his 15 minutes of fame acclaim. And what is YouTube? Answer me that. And as I stated in a former video, I was at my local photo club, yeah, and we had a guest speaker, a guy named Johnny Heldingson. And Johnny is a graphical designer, but also a photographer. And his style blurs the line between a photo and an original artwork, because he calls his style, his contemporary style, for what was it called, digital surgery, or digital kirurgi in Swedish, but digital surgery. And his thing is that he basically takes a picture of a flower pot with some flowers on his kitchen table with a white background, and then he photoshops it, and it can, that picture, the pictures he does in the end, his prints I should say, basically is over 100 layers in Photoshop. So we kind of gone now that full circle from how David Hockney started to see the light with that quantum, you know, news graphics machine, to the launch of Photoshop in 1989 to where we are today. And then we have, you know, like Scott McCloud, who did his book about understanding comics and how different types of graphics, how it can impact us on a subconscious level, and what image story medium what it actually is. So it's the perception of that sometimes colors and shapes and lack of features or the gaining of features will actually impair our vision of the object. That sometimes less is more in the way that the things that are lacking in a image or a photo, we will actually add in our subconscious. And that's a little bit of the things that I want to start to play more with my photography. But at the same time today, when someone posts a experimental picture in a forum or anything, and something is deviating from the status quo, when someone puts out a autumn picture and it is a little bit of a faded colors and it's a little bit more watered down and brown and gray and orange colors that are very muted and very understated, and then someone comes with an autumn picture that is extremely vibrant, that have high saturation, high contrast, and everything is more glossy, people will actually start to ridicule it just by default, because it doesn't adhere to the status quo of what people expect. And that's a little bit of a shame when something goes outside the norm and it is directly ridiculed because it's different and we don't like different, and you know what I mean? Yes, photos are depicting reality. Or is it? A photo is in essence, it is the reflective light of the object of the photograph at the time of the exposure, and also as it was depicted or reproduced by the photographic medium. In that aspect, it's all depending on the wavelength in the visible spectra or invisible spectra of light that can be reproduced by the photographic medium. I mean, don't get me wrong here. There is nothing wrong with being photorealistic and in your imagery, but if nothing is there to challenge the preconceived notions of what a photo should be, I mean, we will stagnate, we won't really develop any further, especially today when I can understand it before when we were limited by the different types of film emulsions we had, but today we have so much more in the way of digital that basically only our imagination and the gear, of course, that we have at our disposal, that's the only limits that we have to what we can create photographically. And now I have to do a jump cut here. Well, here's a thing that I would ask someone to do, to just check themselves of how this can impact you. Because take a picture in Lightroom and do it over to a black and white, convert it to black and white instead of color, yeah? And then you change all the values until you are satisfied with the picture in black and white, how you like it, yeah? And then converted it back to color and see what you've got. And I think you will be quite surprised. Well, all this rambling now for over 10 minutes, what is it all about? Well, I've shown you now a couple of contemporary and unfortunately deceased artists that when they emerged as artists, I mean, when they started out, they were ridiculed because it wasn't what people wanted to see. It wasn't what they were used to see. And I think it's so much the same now. But instead, you don't have to be a known name artist, a known person. I mean, today with the internet and digital technology, we can actually expose our creations much more, it's much more fluent. You don't have to be a college graduated artist in order to, get your work out there. It's so easy to do with your own webpage and with active social media, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You have all the things that you need to get your work out there. And this is just a couple of types of non or abnormal photography styles that I have recently tried and I want to work more with. But every time you put it out there, I'm saying right now, just I can admit I'm not the best photographer in the world. I've never claimed that, and I'm not saying that I might take the most interesting subjects in the world. But what I am saying is that when you try to show a picture as a concept of a new type of technique or a new type of rendition of a existing picture, you're very often people, either they are biased towards what they like themselves, which is natural, of course, or they're hostile to something that is new, because it isn't that classic form of photography. But there are things in photography that has been around for a very long time, like IR photography. IR photography was very popular beforehand. I mean, the cover of the Jimi Hendrix Experience album cover, that was shot with Kodak Aerochrome, which is a false color infrared color film. Yeah. And there is a lot of medical photography that has been done with infrared film, and today Ilford makes the SFX film, which is an IR film that you can use with an IR filter if you have a 35 or a 120 camera and you have a IR filter for it. I mean, I use the D-7200 and the kit lens and an IR filter, so I can do IR photography with that, and I can change that from color or infrared, from color or black and white for IR with my D-7200. Because even though there is an IR filter in the D-7200, you can make IR images as, anyway. You only have to use a very, very long shutter speed. So it's beneficial if you're in a no wind. But anyway, that's one type of photography that gets a little bit of flack here and there. And we've already been into HDR. I mean, this is basically one of the things that weren't possible without digital photography. I mean, high dynamic range is one of those things that, well, as I stated, pioneered by people like Trey Ratcliffe, but now a lot of more people can do it, and I really like HDR. And that goes back to the fact that a photograph doesn't have to really accurately, reproduce reality. As a photographer and also someone that wants to experiment, it might be your, ideal representation of reality. And if you want to have other type of color, colorings and so on, and make it unnatural, if you want to make it like one of David Hockney's pictures, one of his portraits, that's up to you. And who's to say that that's wrong, right? And then my own little thing that I started to do was what I called HDI2R, which is high dynamic infrared range. It was my attempt to originally by bracketing digital IR photography, because you couldn't really meter a good exposure with the camera. It would be very long exposures. So then I had to bracket it to kind of guesstimate where a good exposure would be. But then I thought that, well, I still have images in all of these, even though the exposure time is different. Why don't I try to do an HDR of them? And it worked. And that became my little thing about HDI2R, or high dynamic infrared range photography. And yes, I'm still just experimenting with it, but I think still it's kind of a neat, novel concept. And then we have pictures like this. This is what I would call cartoony HDR. It's inspired by Hockney and Ratcliffe. Why not do HDR but turn some parameters to 11? You know, reference the Spinal Tap there. It goes to 11. When film was the medium, basically, you had a difference of choice with the different film emulsions that were out there. So they had different attributes. I did it in a previous video when I talked about TTS, and that two pictures, or rather two film types that are very much, you know, competing with each other, the same brand, they're both Kodak films, but you have Portra and you have Ektar. While Portra is purpose-made for reproducing great skin tones, Ektar is more of a landscape or outdoors or product film, because it has much more, I think it's red sensitivity, and it's much more contrasty and higher saturation than Portra. So there you have a prime example that before you had these different film emulsions that would give you different types of results. And that's the thing, in my opinion, with cartoony HDR. I like it because it has that unnatural colors that Hockney is famous for using, and it has Ratcliffe's this, you know, aspect of HDR and the sharpness that comes with this type of photography. So this is also one of those times when only your imagination and the gear available to you is the only thing that sets the limits on what you can do. I mean, if you look at different types of cartoons today, both for young and old, animes, cartoons, you have, I think one very popular today is Steven Universe, and I mean, you have all of those. And there you have again Scott McCloud's thing that less features and a little bit more simpler drawings can actually make people care more for characters because they put their own attributes into the character. And you also have those unnatural colors. So why is it so impossible then to take photographs in HDR and make them look a bit cartoony? And okay, next type of photography that I know that many people have a love-hate relationship is lomography. What many consider, I mean, lomography, many people seem to consider lomography to be a cesspool of hipsters using old toy cameras with high quality 35mm or even worse 120 roll film. I mean, to take pictures that are below smartphone quality, image quality. I mean, they're using their Holgas and their Dianas made from unwashed, recycled PET bottles, but lomography can also work in the opposite direction. High quality cameras like these, the Nikon F801 and the Mamiya 645 Pro, these are high quality cameras, but I can still load them with expired old film, black and white or color even. So yeah, I mean, there are special emulsions for these cameras as well. I know lomography has their own contemporary line of films, and they have, you know, I think they have a turquoise, they have a purple, they have even red scale films, and then you have the entire eBay is filled with outdated, expired film emulsions that can be had dirt cheap today. And I mean, I use these, you know, the F801, and then I have Godzilla, as you probably know, my RB67 that I call Godzilla, and then this, the 645 Pro that I now call the CI5 Professional. If you're any British viewers out there, I think you know what a CI5 Professional comes from, excuse me. But then I'm also guilty of using a little bit of a lower quality cameras, like my two M42 35mm cameras, this Zenit TTL, and the Praktica, what was it called? I have it here, Praktica Super TL. I mean, those are also a little bit of a low-mo style cameras, but they still take very decent quality images, and sometimes that's what you want. It all depends on the mood. And then you can always scan the negatives and post-process them to what you want. And then maybe some people think that's a catch-22 and that it takes out the entire thing with lomography, that you're supposed to, only have it what you get out on the negative. But I call BS on that, because for all you lomographers out there who might be watching this, what's the 10th rule of lomography? The 10th rule of lomography is don't worry about rules. So that basically gives you carte blanche to do whatever you want with the negatives after they are developed. And if you want to get them into Lightroom or Photoshop and do whatever you want to them, that's free for all. And then when I did my little mishap or happy accident with Kodak T-Max, that I bought the ISO 400 instead of the ISO 100, all the pictures came out with very low contrast. And that's something that some people, they directly think that if it's low contrast, it becomes much harder for a person to focus on one particular spot. But some people will change that argument and say, well, low contrast, that means that you have a lot more to look through, that you have to scan the image multiple times. You have to look, like David Hockney said. You really have to look in order to get all the details of a picture. So actually, if I'm going to do a medical anecdote to this, when in X-ray, when the CT scanner or computer tomographer came out, the two things that made that a complete success was, first off, you could do axial progression, so you can look at the patient in an axial way, which was impossible before. An axial is basically when, if you imagine you have a loaf of bread, sliced bread, what you only could do with conventional X-ray was you could take a picture from the above, from the side, and any number of degrees. But with a CT, you could basically take an individual bread slice, take it out from the middle of the loaf, and look at it from any angle you chose. So that was one thing. And the second was low contrast resolution. That was the entire thing with a CT scanner, that low contrasts. So if it's good enough for radiologists, doctors, to use low contrast images to diagnose diseases, I think it's good enough for anybody, for the rest of us, to see low contrast pictures. I mean, they have their place, but many times they're ridiculed that they're hard to get a focus point on, that what is the main focus of the image. But as I have examples from my T-Max adventures, low contrast can actually be a benefit. It can give you a particular mood. But now I think I've rambled quite enough. This is going to be a long movie, I'm sure. But I want to hear from you now. What is your opinions on these types of concepts? And what is your opinion on that you might want to try something that you haven't tried before, a different perspective, a different angle, a different type of processing, a different type of, a different type of photography altogether? And how have you been, how have people treated you when you have showed up with something that is outside of the norm, that is something that is completely different? So drop a comment in the comment section below and let me know. But anyway, this is Tobias Bergstrom from T.B.Photo X1.5 to FX, and I would like to see you guys in the next video. And apparently, as you should say in this YouTube malarkey, please like, share, comment, and subscribe, even though this was a long video. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.